In his first veto of the session, Governor Scott sends the Budget Adjustment Act back to lawmakers, citing concerns over the state's motel program and spending.
I feel has been a failed system, and we can do better. If you look pre-pandemic, it was just a shadow of what we created. It was like a monster after that.
Plus, housing developers look to reduce infrastructure costs. And a new public safety report says Vermont's dispatch system needs an overhaul. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's Moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks for joining us on Vermont This Week. I'm Mitch Wertlieb, and it's Friday, March 14th. Joining us on the panel this week, Ann Wallace Allen from 7 Days, Shaun Robinson from VTDigger, and joining us remotely today, Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to dive right into this with the first veto of the session that Governor Phil Scott has made, the budget adjustment over the motel program and some spending. And, we just saw that the remarks that Governor Scott was making there about this program. Shaun, why is the governor vetoing this adjustment over the motel program? What's his beef with it?
Yeah, so beef is a funny word. So budget adjustment is broadly a really technical bill that makes a lot of small changes to state spending partway through the fiscal year, but this focus the past few weeks has really been on, as you mentioned, this provision for the motel program. Legislators had included $1.8 million to extend certain people's eligibility to stay in the program for longer into the warmer months. The administration, as we've known for a long time, is not a fan with that program. They have beef with that program, as you said, and they put forward a compromise, which I can also get into, and legislators rejected that, and the governor, as a result, has said, I'm not going to sign off on it. Before we get into that, because I do want to get to some of the details about, what this beef is all about, we know now that there is not this Democratic supermajority. So, it's unlikely that Democrats are automatically going to have enough votes to override the veto. What's your reading of the room so far as to whether or not this veto is going to stand? Yeah, I think that's a big question that's going to be on everyone's mind going into next week. We've, seen legislators or the Democratic leadership in both chambers, I think, really picking their battles so far this year. We've seen that with the education secretary vote recently and some other pieces of legislation too. So I think we'll see next week, and I'd say it's hard to know right now. But as you mentioned, with the big gains that the Republican Party made in the state last fall, there's enough Republicans in both chambers to uphold a veto if people vote totally along party lines. So we'll see that. Digging more into this about why the governor was against this, and Wallace Allen, you've been writing about this as well. And I'm curious as to, we heard that the remarks that the governor made there at the top, saying, pre-pandemic this was one thing, and then afterwards he called it a monster. I mean, pretty strong language there. Is it a fair comparison to compare the motel voucher program, housing these folks pre-pandemic to now?
Well, I think he was referring to the fact that there were just a few hundred people in motel rooms pre-pandemic, and now there's 1,450 or 1,500, and the state is spending $38 million a year to house people in motel rooms. So it's true that so much has changed since the pandemic that it's not as though we're doing that in those conditions. I mean, the reason we are in this place is that there isn't really anywhere else for them to live. It's not possible for them to rent a place to live. We all know that. Even if you have a pretty good job with high pay, you're not going to find an apartment. They just don't exist, and they're very expensive. So it has created a situation where this is where we see ourselves, where we're paying a lot of money to house people in a less than efficient manner. And certainly since the pandemic, the housing crisis has gotten worse. The homelessness problem has only gotten worse, and there's a lot of vulnerable people. Exactly. I mean, when I said less than efficient, I think that for people who are watching this and activists who are sending letters to the governor or showing up at the State House to testify, the governor would say it's not an ideal situation for the people who are living in motel rooms either. It's sort of just a stopgap measure without a lot of the services they need, and in some cases they're not very conveniently located to downtown areas. So I don't think everyone's totally happy with the solution, but for people who don't want the state spending to end, they're saying, where else are they going to go at this point? What else are they going to do?
Well, Shaun, the governor isn't just scrapping this program completely. He's offering a compromise. What is he talking about here?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, officials from his administration came to budget writers in the House and Senate and said, here's something that we will do. And they proposed actually taking a bit more state money, it's $2.1 million instead of $1.8 million. And instead of having the state spend that money, they said, let's take that money and divvy it up and give it out to municipalities as grants, essentially. And we can let local leaders figure out how to use it to address, presumably to address this crisis, these issues in their communities. One of the ways that local leaders could use that money, of course, is to pay the costs of allowing people to continue staying in motel rooms. So in some ways, it's the same end result, right, but just a different process of getting there. And that process is what legislative leaders pretty promptly said, we don't agree with your solution here. They said we don't want local leaders to take on this additional burden of work, particularly over the past couple of weeks with town meeting day and select boards turning over, things like that. They said, this is an issue that the state should deal with. It's a program that the state stood up in the first place, right? So let's keep the responsibility to deal with it at the state level.
And before we move on from this, and I want to follow up on what Shaun is saying here, because, I think one of the perhaps criticisms is that municipalities, do they have the support staff? Do they have the people in the expertise to handle this kind of money, even if it is more money?
I think that we've really seen since the housing crisis became worse that municipalities most of them aren't equipped to be in the business of providing housing, whether that be building housing or helping people convert buildings into housing or creating homeless shelters or places where people in need can live. They don't have the administrative power, and volunteers. A lot of the towns and cities have housing committees, but their scope is also pretty limited in what they can do. I mean, that's a big, complicated job. That's a development job.
Okay, and we'll see what happens, whether or not the veto stands. Other big news, Zoe Saunders was confirmed as Vermont's Secretary of Education. A year ago, this did not look like it was something that was going to happen. Democrats in the legislature were certainly against this. Shaun, what's changed now? Phil Baruth, for example, is saying that this is not a fight we want to have, and she was confirmed.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, Phil Baruth, he's someone who voted against Zoe Saunders' confirmation last year, right? And he's leader of Democrats in the Senate, face of the Senate in a lot of ways, and I think embodies that shift. In the comments that Senator Baruth made, he said, look, the Democrats maybe they didn't believe initially when Zoe Saunders and the administration came up and said, we are going to put forward a big comprehensive plan for changing how education works broadly in the state. But they did that, right? They did that this year, and now legislators are in the process of parsing through that, and we'll see what ultimately, sugars off and comes out at the end of the session in May or in June. But yeah, I think to your point, and I mentioned this before, but Democrats are really picking their battles, I think, this year in both chambers. And, the BAA, as we just talked about, that's one area where, Democrats had enough votes to pass it. They passed it. And a lot of Republicans, pretty much all of them, I think, with some exceptions, voted against that in the House and Senate. But the Ed Secretary, Baruth and others have said, let's put that politics of that aside for right now, and let's focus on the policy work here.
Yeah, because education reform is such a big thing to get your hands wrapped around to begin with, and I guess they don't want to just spend all the time worrying about who's going to head up the education for the state. So Zoe Saunders is in. I want to talk about legislative crossover week, Shaun. This is something you're covering very extensively at the State House. Kind of explain to us what this means, legislative crossover, because I know there's bills about policy and then there's the money side of things.
Sure. So and I think crossover it's kind of a weird term in some ways, right? And so to your point, this week is the legislature's sort of self-imposed deadline, emphasis on self-imposed, to have bills that have to do with policy generally out of their main committees of jurisdiction. So like an environment bill getting passed out of an environment committee. And then next week is what they sort of call money crossover, which means that bills that have implications for state spending or taxing, that's their deadline to come out of a major important committee. And of course, from the committees, they then go down to the floor for folks to consider broadly.
And so this week, what are some big things that you're watching for?
Yeah, I sort of spin a wheel and pick a topic, right? And we can talk about one. But there's a legislation moving to repeal the clean heat standard. That's a huge topic. There's been rallies in the State House about that. Legislation to rework the permitting process to maybe make it easier to build housing in more parts of the state. Gosh, I could go on, but those are just two that come off the top of my mind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for updating us on that. And you've been writing about something really interesting. Housing developers are looking to reduce their infrastructure costs. I mean, of course, housing is so important right now. And this gets into something called TIF, tax increment financing. Super sexy topic. Everybody loves talking about it. But you've been writing about it really well and explaining what this is. And there's some new ideas around TIF about getting the money maybe more directly to some developers. What can you tell us about what's happening here?
Okay, so tax increment financing is a tool that cities and towns use to promote all kinds of development. Like they might take a blighted area, an area that's not used, and a site that has an old parking lot on it, and it's heavily regulated by the state. But basically, they create a district and borrow money in order to put down the things that developers need, like water or sewer or sidewalks or streetlights or whatever it is that will promote development, with the hopes that then somebody will build a building there, or in the case of St. Albans, which has done this really, really well, several buildings, and then suddenly it goes from being a property that doesn't generate much property tax to being one that generates a lot of property tax, and then ideally, if this all works out, that will help pay back the bond. So now we're at a point in the housing conversation in the State House where they have pretty much exhausted the possibilities for permit reform. I mean, there's a bunch of other proposals out there, but they're kind of waiting to see how things have worked out over the last couple of years, the ones that are in place. And there's a lot of money going to various affordable housing agencies, and a group called Let's Build Homes, which is a nonprofit group of many, many developers and other stakeholders in housing.
Pretty new group too, right? Sorry
brand
to interrupt.
New, yeah.
Okay.
With Moreau Weinberger as their face in the State House. This fall, they proposed a very small TIF-like instrument where a developer, instead of being a section of town, it could be a housing development. And this is sort of like a bid to get more housing, especially in areas outside of Chittenden County, by saying we'll pay for your water and sewer, or we'll help pay for, or the municipality will, and when the thing is built, the tax revenues will accrue to the town. And also part of this, the inducement is that housing itself is seen as a social good, and also the Scott administration has its own version, and the lawmakers who work on housing in the state are merging these varieties of the small TIF.
So sounds interesting. It sounds like they're kind of, micro-targeting some areas, trying to get, again, housing is so important, it's so needed. But as you wrote in your article, the state auditor not happy about this, not a fan of TIF. Why not?
Doug Hoffer is a longtime foe of TIF, as he would be the first to tell you. Well, one of the reasons is that the state property tax goes into the education fund, and with tax increment financing, a little bit of an increment of that comes out to repay the municipality or the bond. So opponents of TIF see that as something that takes away from the education fund, where supporters of TIF say, well, the building that is now so much more valuable and generating so much more tax wouldn't have been there in the first place without TIF. So actually, they say that there's a net gain for the schools. But really, the problem with TIF is that it is kind of hard to prove that if you hadn't done that work to ease the way for the developer, that the development wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Interesting. And also, I think Doug Hoffer was also pointing out that he says there tend to be a lot of accounting errors when you get into TIF financing.
Yes, he's studied them very, very carefully, and they're extremely complicated, which is actually going to make it difficult for any city or town to do a TIF. I mean, you have to have a pretty good size in a staff to go through the paperwork to do this. And he has audited some Burlington TIFs and found that there were sizable accounting errors in them.
Really, really interesting article. Check it out in 7 days. Let's bring Howard Weiss-Tisman into the conversation. Hello, Howard, and thank you for joining us remotely today. You had a really interesting article writing about Vermont's safety report, and the dispatch system needs an overhaul, apparently. pretty important in a state with a lot of rural areas, remote areas. What is the problem with this dispatch system, if there is one?
Yeah, so lawmakers asked the Department of Public Safety to take a look at this a couple of years ago. They've been working on it. An important thing I want to point out right away, so this is a draft report, and what the department is really stressing now is they're looking for input. So they put these numbers out. They really want people to weigh in on this. There's information on our website, on the story I wrote, on how you can get involved with this. This is happening this month. But it's interesting. It's a lot of the same conversation we're having about our schools and about our hospitals and about everything else. We have 37 dispatch centers in the state, and that's 37 separate rooms with people on phones, moving phone calls around. Once E911 comes in, they're calling the police and fire, emergency. The report pointed out in other parts of the country with 640, 50,000 people like we have in Vermont, they have one dispatch center, and we have 37. And there are some towns where they're like two different. So an E911 call comes in and one call's going out to the police and one call's going out to the fire. So it's very inefficient. They're calling for some really big changes. Again, very much like the education reform plan we're seeing. They want to see 6 centers in the state. So all of these boil down, simplifying it, bringing in new technologies that are now available, which weren't available in the past. So, it's really interesting. They talk throughout the report, again, hearkening back to our school discussions, there's a lot of local control issues. There's a lot of old animosity between departments that are right near each other. So the report recognizes it's going to be a heavy lift, that a lot of people are going to have to kind of, put down their pitchforks and look at really what's best for Vermont, really what's the best for our public safety system. So it's some really big changes, and we'll see if it goes through. Again, this is a draft report. They're looking for input now. They're going to put a final report together later this year and then go to the legislature and talk about it.
How long is that public input period, Howard?
It's through March. They're holding meetings. They're gathering input. So it's throughout this month.
Now, you've also been writing about more help sought from Vermonters on high-speed internet. And this has to do with, I think, with who needs it, but also who needs the right equipment to get to this high-speed broadband, which has been expanded in the state recently, right?
Right. So the broadband build-out is moving forward. There's a very large chunk of money that the state is getting a little bit nervous about. The Trump administration has voiced its displeasure about this BEAD program. The state's expecting $229 million to continue the broadband build-out. But this program you're talking about, as you said, is geared more towards folks that aren't familiar with technology, people that might not have computers. So if you are bringing broadband into these rural areas, if you have folks, maybe older folks who aren't familiar with it, the state is trying to both offer training and also get them equipment. They're going to try to set up a donation place where other people can donate their older equipment and then get it to these folks, low-income people that need the help. So it's interesting, and that's ongoing now. They're reaching out. They're working with social service agencies around the state that are working with these populations. So it's an interesting program.
And briefly, Howard, is it fair to say there's a sense of urgency here because of what you said about the Trump administration not being a fan of this kind of funding?
Well, that is interesting. The state, they think they have this money. This money is here. I talked to the person who works at the VCBB, and she said, we're just going to keep doing this work until someone tells us we can't. So they think the money's here. They think this program is a go. And as of filming, as we say, it's going right now. But
we are used to we're used to having that kind of whiplash effect where things change so quickly. But thank you for giving us the latest on that, Howard. Very much appreciate it. And Wallace Allen, Again, the federal effect here and what's happening in Washington affecting the University of Vermont, the largest university here in the state. There's a 2-month hiring freeze that's going on at UVM now amid federal funding uncertainty. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, UVM gave its community plenty of warning that they were having some budgetary problems. Last fall, they said that they were going to be facing a $10 million budget deficit on a budget of about $940 million, I think it is. And in January, the VP of Finance asked unit directors to look for places where they could find efficiencies. In other words, maybe jobs they could cut or programs that they could shrink. And that was a sign. He said, we're going to wait until March to see if that's actually going to play out, but we need you to look now. And, he has said throughout, this is Richard Kate, he's the VP of Finance, he has said throughout, it's not so much tuition revenues as it is rising health insurance costs, which are enormous at UVM. I mean, he expects them, they went up, I think, 17% last year, and he expects them to go up in by a similar amount this year. So that is what is causing a lot of UVM's budgetary problems. However, UVM has been took a turn about 5 years ago toward really emphasizing research funding as a way to make up for the fact that it's a big university in a small area drawing from a small pool of students, and that tuition is never going to be a really, really big part of their income. So they've been very bullish on research. They hired Kirk Dombrowski, who's been just creating all these connections and helping people to bring in big federal grants. And then we know what has happened with federal grants lately.
Yeah.
So they've had the hiring freeze, and now we've seen what's happened at other universities already with grants being curtailed or cut, either because they're deemed wasteful by the Trump administration or because they're in areas like climate change research or justice and equity or DEI, and they are now starting to see that happening at UVM. It's not some big axe falling on a program or something like that. It's a program maybe at another university where a UVM researcher is associated, shrinking, and it's just like little cuts happening.
Well, another program that the Trump administration is not fond of, Howard, is a program that sent local food to Vermont schools. It is losing its funding now. This also helped stock local food shelves with local food. Is that right? What's happening there?
Yeah. Our audience is as tired about hearing about this as we are about talking about it. But this one is like, you read it and you just can't even believe it. So this was USDA money that was bringing local fruits and vegetables and meat into the schools. And the state got a letter last week that the USDA Trump administration was not going to be providing this money for the next growing season. This was a nationwide decision. This was not just Vermont. They cut this whole program. And I spoke to, as you said, it was two things. It was local food into the schools, and it was also helping bring local food to food shelves and folks that otherwise can't afford local food. Local food tends to be a little more expensive.
Yeah.
I spoke to a food hub that was working with local schools that said absolutely there were schools that had never had local food before. With this money, they were able to bring in some stuff. So it was a very successful program. The state was hoping to get more money for this growing season. There were farmers who were just starting their plants now, were hoping to be a part of it, and the money got shut off. We printed this story, published this story a couple days ago, and we're getting a lot of comments. People are really concerned. People are really upset about this one. I mean, as we've said, there's a lot of whiplash going on, paying attention to this, but school being shut off, local food in schools that's a tough one.
We're in interesting times, to say the least. I will endeavor to do my best to end on a high note. At the time that you're seeing this, it looks, I think the UVM women's basketball team will be wrapping up their game against Albany, the Great Danes. This is the America East Conference Championship. Third year in a row, the UVM women's team has made it to the conference. If they won that game, and I hope they did, they are going on to the big dance, an automatic bid to the NCAA tournament. That's all we've got the time for today. I want to thank our panel and Wallace Allen from 7 Days, Shaun Robinson from VTDigger, and joining us remotely, Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Thanks for watching Vermont This Week. Hope you'll join us again next week.